Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I thought we would have a look at the rules for something that's rather iconic in the Napoleonic period. It's something that's fairly unique to this era of wargaming, although there were variations of it before and after, and that is the infantry battalion square. Now, aficionados of later black powder periods will know that they ended up using the divisional square, certainly the British did, and this was a very different beast. There's a really good example of the divisional square in the most recent, I say the most recent-ish Four Feathers film with Guy Pearce and Heath Ledger in it. Shows the Sudanese attack on a divisional square. It's pretty epic. But we're not talking about divisional squares today. We are talking about battalion squares. What they were used for, what their rules are in black powder, and how we can use them on the tabletop. So the square was primarily a defensive formation. Ideally, it would consist of a unit hollow in the middle and 4 ranks deep around each side. The front 2 ranks of these would be kneeling with the butts of their muskets in the ground. The rear 2 ranks would be standing and pouring as much fire as they can into the enemy. They are a defensive formation, and as such you can't really move very fast when you're in one. You can move in black powder. They say that if there's enemy cavalry within 12 inches, a square is unable to move. And that's fair enough. It keeps it nice and simple. But in history, they did actually move. The Battle of Salamanca on day 2, I think it was the 7th Division, were quite strung out on the plain of Salamanca to the south of the main British army. And they managed to extricate themselves despite being attacked by dragoons. But the idea is that you form a solid wall into which a horse is just not going to charge. The rider can spur them on as much as they want, but the horse is just not going to charge a solid object that's directly in front of it. They're not exactly known for being the world's most aggressive creatures, are they, after all? Now, the most effective angle for a cavalryman to charge infantry from is not actually the rear, it's actually the flank, because that minimises the amount of shots back. The rear, however, is a very close second. The rear is pretty tasty, unless the enemy turn around and can fire a volley like the South Gloucesters did. But in all things being equal, the flank and the rear are really, really strong places for cavalry to attack, because it means they can attack with very little fighting coming back their way. They can maximise their momentum, and they can maximise the amount of damage that they do on the charge. This is what a square prevents. The square has no flanks, it has no rear. Whichever angle you approach the square from, you're going to be coming up against a 4-man deep wall of bayonets and shot. Now, there are other types of square as well. We'll talk about those more when we get into the second section of the video, where we talk about the black powder rules for them. But one of them was a solid square. The ones that we're talking about here are the iconic ones you may have seen in the Waterloo film, where you've got a hollow square, you've got the dudes around the perimeter with the command group in the middle. A solid square is, as the name suggests, tended to be used by Prussians and Austrians, and that is where the guys on the outside just poke their bayonet sideways. So it becomes a little bit like a hedgehog. So we've talked about the ways that squares were useful, particularly against cavalry. What were their limitations? Well, the first thing is they were very densely packed. If you think you've got 4 guys, shoulder to shoulder, one behind the other, this makes them an absolutely ideal target for artillery. And that's why in pretty much all sets of rules, and black powder is no exception, artillery gets a bonus for firing at squares. And that's really the best way of dealing with a square. Well, one of the best ways is, this is where horse artillery in particular can be handy, is the cavalry force the enemy into square, the horse artillery gallop up and limber, and then from outside of musket range, they can start pouring fire into that square. Also, they were very weak against infantry. Obviously, if you've got, for argument's sake, 400 men in your battalion, then you can fire 400 dudes at the enemy as they're coming towards you. If you're in a square, then you can only fire 100 dudes at them, and they've still got the same number of firing back. So they're not very good at both shooting and close combat against infantry. They're obviously very vulnerable to artillery, but they are very strong against cavalry, to the extent that in black powder, unless you are disordered, you cannot complete a charge with cavalry against an infantry square. If enemy cavalry do contact a square, usually if it's disordered, then they usually suffer a number of negatives. So the first one is that they lose any charging bonus. Now this is usually +1 to hit, but it can be anything like gallop at everything, so they'll lose their full rerolls to hit. Lancers will lose their save modifier and things like that. So you lose all of your charging bonuses, which is a bad thing to start off with. The second thing is the enemy get +2 to their combat res before you've even started. So that's static combat res. Now, this is slightly mitigated by the fact that squares cannot be supported by other units. They can support, but they cannot be supported. So it means that they could actually be one worse off if they had 2 flanks and a rear, but most of the time, +2 is fine for that. And it means that unless you're heavy cavalry, you're going to be at a distinct disadvantage. Finally, it also means that the square don't suffer the negatives for fighting cavalry, so the -1 to hit or anything like that. Although they'll still be at -1 because they'll be disordered, because that's how the cavalry have managed to charge them. So with all this talk of ordered and disordered squares, how do we actually get into that in the first place? Now, there are 2 ways of doing it. The original rules had it that if a battalion was charged by cavalry and that battalion had the special rule must form square, which basically every Napoleonic unit does, then the only charge reaction, or Napoleonic infantry unit has, then the only charge reaction that they can declare is that they are forming square. This was you roll 2 dice on a double 1, then they formed square but it was disordered. On a double 6, then they just stayed in line, and on any other number, they successfully formed square. Now, fortunately, this has changed. Now, anyone who's coming to the Under Eagles to Glory event in Derby will be playing the rules that are given under Clash of Eagles. And that is in order to form a hollow square. So we're talking any French-related troops, so French, Italians, Württembergers, Neapolitans, all that good stuff. And the British, they need to do a command roll. So if their brigade commander is, for argument's sake, strategy rating 8, then they need to roll an 8 or less to form square. I should say this is on page 98 of A Clash of Eagles. The unit forming square does get a bonus to their roll, however, if the cavalry start more than 1 move away. So if they start 2 moves away, then your strategy rating is at +1. If they start 2 moves away, then your strategy rating is at +2. So that gives you a bit more of a bonus if someone launches those long bomb charges at you. Now, if you're an Austrian or a Prussian, then it's similar. But, well, to be fair, if you're an Austrian, you don't even need to form square. You're just in divisional mass. So that means that you're basically in a column/square all the way. And the Prussians, they form a closed square, which means that they can still be contacted, but they get the benefits of being in square as well. So it's not necessarily a good idea for the cavalry to charge home in that situation. Now, squares are a bit of an interesting feels-bad mechanic in Napoleon in Black Powder, because it means that the cavalry don't get to complete their charge and the infantry are pinned in place. And if you're in a large game and you're the cavalry commander, it can feel like you're not really doing anything all day because you just sat there watching the infantry. But as I say earlier on, that can be quite helpful in itself. It can pin them in place, allowing the artillery to bring the pain and start hitting those squares and causing considerable damage. Now, one of the things that I dislike about Black Powder is that all the firing comes after the moving and automatically comes off at the end of the enemy's turn, because it means that you can't disorder a square from firing and then charge it with the cavalry. So that's a bit of a shame. I've spoken before about how I think there should be an artillery phase at the start of the turn, so before movement, but that's just me. That's just me getting on my soapbox. But I do think it makes sense, though. When it was just that it happened, or a square was basically happened, 34 out of 36 times, then I think that genuinely was a real problem. However, now, around about 60% of the time the square's going to get formed, but the rest of the time it won't. So you've got that real opportunity to get the cavalry in there. Now, again, it's kind of tucked away in the special rules in Clash of Eagles, but infantry against cavalry are going to have a really, really bad time. On page 100 of Clash of Eagles, it says, infantry who are caught by cavalry when not in square, close square or divisional mass, suffer a -3 combat result modifier. If they are required to take a break test, they suffer a -1 to their roll. And if you are in square, you don't have that. So you automatically start at -3. If the enemy's got, say, dragoons, that makes it -4 because they've got heavy cavalry 1. If it's cuirassiers or, carabineers, heavy dragoons, you could potentially be at -6 before the combat's even started. So absolutely not advised. Now, if you are disordered in a square, or you are in one of those Prussian closed columns, and you're in combat, one of the pluses is that the only real morale result you have to care about is a 4 or less. You're never going to be pushed back or anything like that. You only ever break, and that's if you roll a 4 or less. So that's quite handy as well. It does mean that excess casualties will count towards that, but pretty much everything else you can ignore. You've got no flanks, you've got no rear, etc., etc. So squares can be very powerful against cavalry in general, and it's one of those things where if we look at, say, the event pack, because it's some of the scenarios around capturing ground, then it can be very useful to sit yourself on that objective, form square, and you're pretty much safe as long as there's no artillery or infantry in the area. Why is it bad if you're fighting infantry? Well, the infantry will get their full attacks against you, so 6, usually. You're only going to get 2 attacks back. I should have said even against the cavalry, you'll only get 2 attacks back as well. But they get their full attacks back at you, and they can be supported as well. Remember, squares cannot be supported, but they can support other units. And that's where another usefulness of them comes in, which is almost forming like a castle wall with them. This is l'ordre mixed, as the French call it, sort of, in so much as you can have maybe 2 battalions in line, and then at each end you've got squares anchoring those ends in place. It also means that if the cavalry charge the line units, then they don't have to form square, and they can just stand and fire, and it means that they don't suffer the minuses for fighting against cavalry in line, or any of that good stuff, because they've got no flanks or rear. In order to get around the flanks and the rear, they have to go all the way around the square, and the horses, that's going to be way too far. The difference between this and l'ordre mixed is that because you've got the squares, they can't really move very far. I think they can move 3 inches a turn, whereas the French, they have attack columns on the end, doing effectively the same job, so that means that they can move at full speed. So that's it really, just a quick one today. I wanted to cover off squares, because we've not really talked about them before, and the number of changes to the rules for forming squares that there are. So the rules that we use, and the rules that we'll be using for Derby, are that if cavalry declare a charge, if you're in line or column, then you need to, and you have the must form square special rule, then you roll 2 dice. If you get the strategy rating or less, once it's been modified, and that's for distance of the enemy charge, things like being on a road or being in column or whatever, then if you score equal to or under the strategy rating, then you get to form square. Now, if you are if you are militia, then you become disordered if you roll a double. You still get to form square, but you become disordered. If you roll higher than that, then you stay in the formation that you were caught in, and the enemy cavalry get to go to absolute town on you. This could normally be particularly bad, because if the cavalry can destroy that infantry unit, which, let's face it, they should do, they can then pursue into another unit which doesn't get to charge react at all, i.e. they don't get to form square either. So that can be an absolutely devastating turn of events, and that's quite realistic. It's something like the Battle of Albura. The Vitiate Legion just scythed through a British division in, I think it was something like 6 or 7 minutes, I think. So it is, it's relatively historically accurate. The other example from going the other way would, of course, be at Waterloo, where de Erlon's corps was basically annihilated by the charge of the Union Brigade. So these things did happen. I like that you can charge disordered squares. That's how squares get broken. Something like the Battle of Garcia Hernandez in Spain, where the KGL broke the French square, 2 French squares there. This is the kind of thing that would be, definitely noteworthy and worth mentioning to the judges if you're at the Derby event. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this Derby event, then it is Under Eagles to Glory. It is a Napoleonic weekender. It is not a tournament. It is just an excuse to get together and have 4 games against like-minded opponents. Tickets are selling super fast. I'm really, really blown away with the support that you guys have given me, and Boards and Swords. So thank you very, very much for those of you who've bought tickets. Those of you who are still thinking about it, just know that we have sold over half the tickets, maximum tickets now. We've sold way more than I actually thought we would sell. So we've sold more than the actual maximum. So make sure that if it's something that you're umming and ahhing about, make sure you get in there and get your tickets sooner rather than later, because I'd hate for people to miss out. But that is all. Do any of you have fun stories about when you've broken enemy infantry squares with your cavalry? Or have you seen off swaths of enemy guard cavalry by having one unit of Opolcheny pikemen in square? That would be quite fun, to be fair. Or can you think of historical examples where squares either stood up to things they shouldn't have done, or where they were defeated and broken, like at Garcia Hernandez? Am I right in thinking at Leipzig, the Russian Guard formed square, and they were just, along with some, was it the Prussians? It might have been the Russian Guard and some Prussian Landwehr, I think, formed square, and they just got absolutely battered by French artillery. I could be wrong on that one, but I think it was. Let me know down in the comments below, and thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.